I came to the philosophy of language and to philosophy more generally through linguistics, really. I was studying syntax and semantics of natural language. I was a graduate student at MIT in linguistics, and I realized I was getting drawn more and more into philosophical issues. And I felt that all the action seemed to be going on at Stanford at the time. So I transferred over to Stanford, and John Perry, who became my advisor, made it possible for me to transfer from the linguistics PhD program at Stanford into the philosophy PhD program. So that's what led me into this. And I started then getting very interested in metaphysics, and I was working on events. And it became clear to me that you couldn't actually put forward any coherent theory of events without having a theory of descriptions of events, because you can describe the same event in two different ways. But it led me straight back into thinking about descriptions themselves and Russell's theory of descriptions. And I'd already been interested in Grice's work through working on issues in semantics and pragmatics when I was doing linguistics. And it seemed to me now that these just came together in this blindingly obvious way. And then I realized, in fact, it had been blindingly obvious to Grice and to Kripke too. And that seemed to me I was on the right track. That seemed good enough pedigree for me. If Grice and Kripke were going this direction, this had got to be the right way to go. And so I decided to explore that and milk it to, as much as possible. Bertrand Russell was a mathematician philosopher teaching at Cambridge. By the beginning of the 20th century, he was working very fully in issues in the foundations of mathematics, and was very drawn to the program of reducing mathematics to logic. At the same time, he was very interested in the philosophical implications of the sort of technical work in the foundations of mathematics, foundations of logic that he was working on. So he worked with mathematicians like Whitehead, and worked with philosophers, G. Moore. And he's really the person most responsible, at least in Britain, for bringing together mathematics and philosophy in the way that we've become accustomed to seeing them related, essentially through logic. Yeah, in 1905, Russell was still involved in a program of reducing mathematics to logic. And it's really in that program that we find the origins of things that drove Russell to the theory of descriptions. There were other reasons lurking in the background which became more prevalent as time went on. There were issues in epistemology, in ontology, and questions in what we today call the philosophy of language, which really had an impact on how the whole theory evolved. But the underlying force of this was still this logicist project of reducing mathematics to logic. Gottlob Frege was a mathematician, philosopher, logician, teaching at the University of Jena. He was interested in issues in the foundations of arithmetic, foundations of mathematics more generally, and issues in logic, and saw that deep philosophical questions arose in trying to formulate systems, languages which were to be useful for the expression of the language of mathematics. Russell certainly later announced the theory of descriptions as part of a solution to a particular paradox which arose out of Frege's work. Whether or not this is genuinely what was motivating him in the first place is a topic of great debate now in historians of logic and history of philosophy. And it looks as if Russell's own views about what led to the theory sort of modified themselves over time in his own mind. But yeah, he certainly saw the solution to the paradox as one contribution that the theory of descriptions could make. It could lead towards a solution to this paradox. But there were other issues, like the fact that certain referring expressions seem not to refer to things like Pegasus or Sherlock Holmes or the largest prime number. They don't seem to be real things that these expressions refer to. And so the sort of paradoxical situations were arising in what we now call the philosophy of language too, and in logic itself, which the theory of descriptions was meant to be a large part of the solution to these variety of these problems. So if you think about names, if you use a name and you say Fred is tall, you get the impression that you're using the name Fred to refer to some particular person, and then you're using the rest of the sentence, the predicate is tall, to say something about Fred, that is, say something about the thing you've referred to. And it would seem that that's what gives the sentence its meaning. It's about Fred and about this property that Fred has, being tall. Now, what do you do then when you have a sentence where the subject expression doesn't seem to refer to anything? If there is no object that you're ascribing a property to, how can the sentence even have a meaning if having the meaning involves predicating something of something? So if you say, well, the largest prime number is odd, you might think that's a meaningful sentence to start with. It certainly sounds like a perfectly meaningful sentence of English. But we now know, of course, there is no largest prime number. So what is that sentence even about? You can say, well, look, here's what we'll do. We'll postulate non-existent objects. So the largest prime number doesn't exist. It's a thing that doesn't exist. And that already smacks of a sort of contradictory or paradoxical feel to it. Here's this thing that doesn't exist, and we can say something about it, that it's odd. That seems already weird. And Russell, in his earlier work, seemed to be not too bothered about positing such entities in a way that Meinong was alleged not to have been too. And for reasons that we're not really clear about, Russell came to think it was a bad idea to posit such entities, and that he had a way of dealing with the issues in such a way you didn't have to posit such entities. You could make sense of these sentences without having to posit non-existent entities. So that was certainly, at the very least, a side benefit of the theory of descriptions, even if it wasn't the original motivating force. Willard van Orman Quine, great logician professor of philosophy at Harvard, was particularly worried about ontological issues. He had a very austere view of logic, according to which logic is just extensional first-order logic. And he didn't want to get involved in ontological commitments to weird and wonderful entities, intentional entities, and so on, that he thought just cluttered the landscape in a way and made philosophy and logic a lot more difficult than they needed to be. Quine was a great fan of Russell's theory of descriptions, but not entirely for the reasons that everybody else is a fan of the theory of descriptions. Quine really thought this was a way to purify our ontology. I'm not sure if he uses exactly that phrase, but that phrase gets used a lot. It may well be one of Quine's, I'm not sure. Anyway, Quine really thought we could purify our ontology by embracing the theory of descriptions, and in fact embracing the theory of descriptions in an interesting form as a theory of proper names too, to sort of rustle them away, as it were. So instead of talking about Socrates, we'd talk about the unique thing which Socratizes. So turning the name Socrates into a description, and thereby avoiding the sorts of problems that you get associated with ordinary proper names. Whether Russell would have thought Quine was making the best use of the theory of descriptions, that's an open question. But it's certainly, as I said earlier, it wasn't Russell's principal motivation. It wasn't what led him towards the theory of descriptions, even if it was the case that when he was sort of homing in on it, he now saw, here's this interesting benefit. This makes the thing look a lot more interesting and exciting than I thought. Certainly that's true, but it wasn't the motivating force. Though for Quine, and for people a lot of people influenced by Quine, they see this as the great benefit of the theory of descriptions, and so they've been led to this historical inference that it was what led Russell to the theory of descriptions, but the evidence suggests that wasn't what led Russell to the theory of descriptions. So So the proposal was then that when you have an expression that begins the so-and-so, like the King of France, the largest prime number, so on, those expressions aren't names. They don't function like names. They're denoting phrases. They have the same general form as, if you let's take the King of France. Well, every King of France, no King of France, some King of France, the King of France, that King of France. Russell thought those all had the same syntactic form, which they do, and he talks about this in the very first paragraph of On Denoting, these denoting phrases. And he thought that names were very different, and that phrases of the form the so-and-so, like the King of France, were much more like every King of France or no King of France. They're quantified expressions. So you're making an existence claim. So when you say the King of France is bald, for Russell, it's not like saying Fred is bald. You're referring to Fred and then saying something about Fred, the fact that he's bald. With the King of France is bald, you're saying there exists one and only one thing that has the property of being King of France, and that one thing is bald. So you're making an existence claim. You're making a claim about the existence of something that is a King of France. If there isn't a King of France, then what you've said is false. So instead of the sentence being, as he thought, the only option before was being meaningless, the King of France is bald, it now becomes not meaningless, but false. Because when you utter that sentence, you're claiming that there exists a King of France, and there isn't. So what you've said is false. That is, if it's false, it must have some meaning to it. So it's a meaningful sentence that's false, rather than the sentence that seems to be unevaluable, if you like, for things like truth or falsity. So this issue of non-being, which, I mean, Plato discussed this too. Everybody realizes there's a problem here. It's a question of how much you want to give in trying to solve the problem. So you take an expression which seems not to refer to something, yet the sentence containing that expression seems to be perfectly meaningful. How do you explain that? Well, if reference is the dominant notion in a theory of semantics, if the expression doesn't have a referent, it looks like it doesn't have a meaning. So Frege's solution say, well, look, we really need to think about meaning in two ways. There's the referent of an expression, and then there's this other thing, the sense. The sense gets you the referent, if you like. You utter a word, it has a sense, and the sense determines a reference. Or, in some cases, the sense determines that there isn't a reference. So we take something like Pegasus. The problem here is that all the examples you choose from fiction, you choose from mythology, or you choose from things that went awry in science. So Vulcan, the nearest planet, the planet between Mercury and the Sun. Pegasus, winged horse from mythology. You now say that all those expressions, even though they don't have references, they still have a sense. They have some sort of meaning quality. And you need to grasp that meaning quality in order to be a user, a reasonable, competent user of that expression, even if it doesn't have a referent. Russell thought this was a bit crazy, to think that things like these senses, whatever they were for Frege, could be the constituents of propositions, could be the parts of the thoughts that we actually had. So Russell didn't want this two-tier theory, as it were. I mean, Frege's theory is sometimes billed as a two-tier theory. It's a theory according to which words and sentences have senses, but they also have references. Russell thought reference is what we're interested in. This sense stuff is a bit hokey. I can't quite get my mind around it. I think I can derive some sort of paradoxical conclusion by thinking things through. He has this complicated argument, the Gray's Elegy argument, designed to show that it leads to paradox, or perhaps even worse. And he wants to do with just reference. So Russell's solution is to say, no, we've just got reference, but you're now making these existence claims. So when you claim that Pegasus exists, you're saying something false. But that, of course, still leaves open the question, well, wait a minute, in mythology, Pegasus exists. How do you deal with a sentence like that? In Greek mythology, Pegasus exists. In the Sherlock Holmes stories, Dr. Watson exists. Dr. Fred Smith doesn't exist in the Holmes stories, but Dr. Watson, John Watson is it, does exist. So there's still, this can't be the whole solution. Even if it works for descriptions, the theory of descriptions, even if it works for descriptions, it doesn't mean you can extend it straight away to proper names. And one of the interesting features about Russell's intellectual development between, say, 1905 and 1910, 1911 is the theory of descriptions, as it was presented in On Denoting, is a theory about descriptions. The theory of descriptions is a theory that you use to do the semantics of descriptions. But you can see already in the final paragraph he's moving off in this direction, which may seem a bit crazy to start with, of using the theory of descriptions as a theory of names, as a theory of proper names. That is, you use the theory of descriptions to give an account of the semantics of names. So it's very important to distinguish the theory of descriptions as a theory of descriptions and the theory of descriptions as a theory of the way names work. And of course that's where a lot of the interesting issues actually emerge in trying to apply the theory of descriptions to proper names. Ramsey called the theory of descriptions this paradigm of philosophy. And it certainly was regarded, is regarded that way now, but it certainly wasn't on the day that Russell delivered his paper to Mind. G.F. Stout, the editor, took a look at the paper and said, we can't possibly publish this, it's incomprehensible. I have no idea what's going on. And Russell insisted, I forget the details of the story, whether Russell went down to London and made an appointment to see him and said, but anyway, whatever happened, Russell said, I insist on it being published. And Stout rolled over and said, okay, you're Russell, you know what you're doing, we'll publish it. And it took Russell a long time to be able to present the very same ideas in a friendly way. You know, if you're a compassionate teacher teaching the philosophy of language, you do not just give the students On Denoting and say, read this, and then we'll get Russell's theory of descriptions out of this. That's inhumane. That's cruel and unusual punishment. You also give them some of Russell's later works, which are more informal, but they give a much more intuitive picture of what the theory is all about. In particular, his paper, Knowledge by Acquaintance, Knowledge by Description, which was an Aristotelian Society paper, 1910, 1911, sets the theory out much more elegantly, as it were, but at the same time he's already made certain epistemological moves which complicate the issues there. The idea that reference was going to become a really important part of the philosophical tradition, the theory, the study of reference itself, that wasn't really in the air, right? Russell wasn't responding to anything that we would call the philosophy of language, issues in the philosophy of language. There were a few little issues of that nature in the work of Frege and coming out of the work of Russell, but there wasn't this tradition of work in the philosophy of language according to which the theory of reference and quantification and anaphora and presupposition were all part of. That didn't really exist at the time. So yes, in a way Russell is very much at the vanguard of the development of what became this discipline we would now call more or less the philosophy of language or semantics of natural language. Even though Russell's own concerns were not really ordinary language, natural language itself, he, like Frege, thought that English and other natural languages were too imprecise to do serious philosophical work, serious logical work, serious scientific work, should probably be replaced by better languages that were cleaner, that were less ambiguous, and so on. And the theory of descriptions, in some ways, was a way of trying to show how you would actually make descriptions work in a language that was good enough to do science in. But what's happened since then is we've now come to think, hey, maybe natural language is good enough, and maybe definite descriptions in our ordinary talk really do function the way that Russell said they do. And if they don't, they certainly function a lot like that, and we need to try and work out the fine-tuning of the theory as we go on. So yes, he, without intending to inaugurate this tradition that we'd now call the study of reference and philosophy of language, he certainly was the person in the Anglo-American tradition who spearheaded this without really intending to or realizing he was going to. Did Russell really change his mind about what sorts of things he was going to allow in his ontology, or did he just see a nice escape route here so he could now get away without positing certain things. I mean, he wasn't, you can't call him a great enthusiast for the idea of non-existent objects and the like. He was certainly content to posit them in the Principles of Mathematics in 1903. He didn't see any way out of this, and we'll just have to posit these entities. He didn't think that Frege's way of by positing senses was going to help here. But by the time he hit on the theory of descriptions, he now saw a way of actually avoiding committing yourself to the existence of certain types of objects. And you can see why Quine, who of course had a great interest in keeping ontology to a minimum, sees this as a sort of slum clearing exercise by Russell. It's not, I mean, certainly wasn't true that Russell was motivated originally by clearing the slum, as it were. He was motivated by these concerns in logic, the logicist project. But it is true that if you start now saying you're making existence claims when you use definite descriptions, rather than that you're referring to a particular object, you can now avoid certain types of ontological commitment. You can say Bill thinks the largest prime number is odd, without committing yourself to there being a largest prime number, even if you're committing yourself to Bill's thinking there is a largest prime number. Or Bill can actually say something true by saying, I think the largest prime number is odd. Now, it may be true that Bill thinks the largest prime number is odd, but we don't want the fact that there's something true that Bill said to entail the existence of a largest prime number. So this was rather a nice benefit of the existential analysis of this, that you don't commit yourself to these entities. There are two things that get run together a lot in the literature. Russell also defines away classes in Principia Mathematica. So with descriptions, it's a sort of localized elimination. That is, you can by using the theory of descriptions as an account of the semantics of descriptions, you can avoid commitment to the existence of certain objects, because you can have, well, there's sort of technical issues here about the scope of a description with respect to negation. So if I say the King of France is not bald, there seems to be a reading of that, according to Russell, according to which you're saying it's not the case that there's a unique King of France and he's bald, and that's true, unlike the reading of there exists a King of France, and a unique King of France, and he's not bald, which seems to be false. There seems to be an ambiguity, as Russell puts it there. The theory of descriptions gives you the means to explain these types of ambiguities and avoid certain types of existence assumptions by putting the quantifier within the scope of negation. I mean, that's a little, I suppose, technical for this type of discussion right now. But it is true that there is this localized elimination in the sense that you're not forced to posit the existence of a largest prime number. You're not forced to posit the existence of round squares in order to be able to use phrases like the round square or the largest prime number. You can now do this without complete commitment to the existence of such entities. Whereas with Russell's eliminating classes, with his sort of plural theory of descriptions, he seems to be, it's a total ontological elimination, a sort of globalized elimination of classes themselves. And Quine, unfortunately, just sort of runs these two together. He thinks there's this great ontological elimination, a single type of ontological elimination. And that's not true. They're two rather different ones, depending on whether you're thinking of Russell's way of eliminating classes. Unfortunately, Russell uses the same phrase, contextually eliminate descriptions, which of course are phrases, and contextually eliminating classes. Well, classes aren't phrases, classes are, classes of objects. And it's not the same procedure. It's the same process going on in the language used to describe what's going on, but in fact with the description you're eliminating a certain type of phrase and thereby eliminating a certain type of ontological commitment. But with eliminating classes, you're just dispensing with a whole type of entity in your ontology. Now, what actually led Russell to think that this was a good thing? I suspect that, like everybody else, he was troubled all along by positing non-existent objects. I don't think that people are that sanguine about positing non-existent objects. It's okay for them to say, well, you know, so there are non-existent objects in my ontology, so what? You know, it's a formal theory, here's what goes. I don't think people who say that are ever completely happy with that. And I don't think Russell was entirely happy with that. And he saw a way out of that with the theory of descriptions for some types of entities. So Russell's paper ruled the roost, more or less, from 1905 to 1950 on the topic of definite descriptions. G. Moore wrote this paper in 1944 with a few little criticisms and tweaks here and there, mostly sort of friendly amendments, I suppose. Rather long, very good paper actually, that doesn't get read enough. But it wasn't until Strawson's paper in 1950 that things got really interesting and down and dirty. So to understand Strawson's critique, you have to understand it as part of a big change in the way philosophy was being done. So where Russell, like Frege, and people like Carnap and Tarski were talking about expressions themselves, linguistic objects, referring and being true or false and so on. And there was this desire to purify the language now to make it adequate to the needs of science. People like Austin and Strawson and to some extent Grice at Oxford in the 1950s and the late 40s were thinking ordinary language is good enough for doing philosophy. We shouldn't be talking about these words referring to things and sentences being true or false. We should talk about people, agents, us, using languages. It's people that refer to things. They use words to refer to things. It's not words. It's a bit like the NRA saying, you know, guns don't kill people, people do. Well, this was a similar sort of move going on in analytic philosophy at the time. People like Strawson saying, you know, words don't refer to things, people do. Now, of course, it's the people with the words, just as it's the people with the guns, that's really doing it. It's where you now put the emphasis. And there was an emphasis now towards talking about people stating things, people saying things, people asserting things, people referring to things, rather than the language, parts of the language doing these things. So, to that extent, it's not obvious that the battle lines were really joined on the matter of descriptions. There was this big split in the way philosophy was being done, that is, in the way it was done, in the way it used language to tackle philosophical problems. But Strawson focused in on the issue of definite descriptions because this was the sort of paradigm case, the paradigm type of theory which seemed to be taking language itself to be the object of investigation, or at least a type of language, whereas Strawson thought it should be the language users and what they do with the language. I mean, this traces back to Ludwig Wittgenstein and also G. Moore at Cambridge, that we should be thinking about the use of language, reflecting more on the use of language rather than on the language itself, if we're to really understand what meaning is. I mean, people put it in this slogan, you know, meaning is use. I mean, this is not very helpful. But the idea is that by focusing on the use of language, you can get to the bottom of what meaning is, rather than just focusing on language itself as this self-subsistent entity. Now, Strawson attacked the theory of descriptions itself, and I think Grice put this absolutely perfect, a little quip he made to me one day. He just said, Strawson's paper, Peter's paper, it's a wonderful paper marred only by a quite unnecessary discussion of Russell's theory of descriptions. And you can see what Grice meant by this, right? This is great paper brimming with great ideas about how we should be thinking about language and philosophy, but he targets Russell and does it in a way, and he makes a bit of a mess of it if it's to be viewed as an attack on the theory of descriptions itself, rather than on the whole style, way of doing philosophy, which the theory of descriptions actually epitomized. So the arguments against specific pieces of the theory of descriptions don't really seem to work. Strawson says, look, when you say the King of France is wise, I don't think that's false. I don't think it's true. I think it's a crazy sentence to utter. Why would anybody utter that? It's not the sort of thing you could use to say something true right now. It's not the sort of sentence you could use to say something false right now. The question doesn't arise. But in Russell's view, it's false. Of course, what Russell actually meant was the proposition expressed by someone using this sentence right now was false. So Strawson underestimated or didn't quite grasp that Russell was talking about claims, about propositions, about statements that people would be making with the language. And so he placed a lot of emphasis on the difference between a sentence and a use of the sentence and so on, which was really, it sort of missed the point of what Russell was up to. But on the bigger picture, it seems to me Strawson was absolutely right. We should be focusing more on speakers saying things, speakers making statements, speakers referring to things. We get a much better handle on the language and the semantics of the language by going about things in this way. So even if the particular criticisms of the theory of descriptions were, I think, misguided, the more general critique of a style of philosophy that is embedded in that paper seems to me spot on.